Charles Greenawalt, and this is the class of Congress and Lawmaking. For today's section, we would like to cover Congress and national security. Please have your slides with you. You could either have run those off on your printer or have them on your electronic device by your side. But please consult the slides, the PowerPoints, as we go through this material. I think this is one of the best summations that you'll ever see in undergraduate school in the span of one lecture on international relations, on U.S. foreign policy, and how to understand it. But you determine that when we're through. One thing that we want to talk about when we're talking about Congress and national security is we have to understand what the international environment is that the United States operates in. And of course, that's a framework of nation states. The nation state system that we have today began at a definite point in history. It's the result of hundreds of years of the erosion of the medieval structure in Central and Western Europe. And it finally begins with the struggle that the great powers, quote unquote, the great powers, have over Italy in 1494. At this point, the great states were France, Spain, and England. We find that the first nation state in the modern or contemporary era of history is France. It's France under Henry IV. Well, when we're looking at foreign policy, we have to consider what is the basic goal of foreign policy. The basic goal of foreign policy for any nation state has to be what? It has to be survival, doesn't it? Survival. There's 4 types of survival that we can identify. We can talk about the physical survival of the population. We can talk about the survival of the nation state and its culture. Thirdly, we can talk about the survival of the same form of government. And fourthly, we can talk about the survival of the present government of that nation state. So those are the 4 types of survival: the physical survival of the population, the survival of the nation state and its culture, the survival of the same form of government, and finally, the survival of the present government in the nation state. Well, when we look at international politics, what's the meaning of international politics? What should international politics produce? Well, we look at a scholar who's written extensively on this issue in the past, and it's Hedley Bull. Hedley Bull has written extensively and committed his life to this subject. Hedley Bull says that the meaning of international politics is the production of order and justice. Order and justice. When we look further, and Hedley tries to define what the 3 elements of order are, the 3 elements of order he believes are physical survival, security of economic possessions and property, and lastly, the sanctity of agreements. So Hedley Bull breaks order into 3 parts. He breaks it into physical survival, security of economic possessions and property, and sanctity of agreements. Well, we continue on and we look at international politics, and we look at our nation state. And one of the very first things that any politician has to do who wishes to serve at the national level or above in government and politics is that they have to decide which role they think is the best for the United States in the world. And there are only 4 roles possible for the United States in the world. What are those 4 roles? Well, one is the United States could adopt a policy of isolationism. The policy of isolationism would be that we are not concerned with anything beyond our borders. This idea is somewhat based on George Washington's farewell address in 1797. find that Washington was warning about entangling alliances for the United States. The United States was an infant country, and he was warning about becoming enmeshed in the power politics of Europe. He wanted us to develop our own country before we engaged in foreign entanglements, as he said. A second possible role for the United States could be found in the Monroe administration. James Monroe, of course, issued the Monroe Doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine came out of discussions that the British were having with the Americans in regard to the Western Hemisphere. The British wanted all other European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere from that point in time, the beginning of the 19th century, as did the United States. And the United States understood that the instrument that would bring this policy into being, into fruition, would be the Royal Navy of the British Empire. And so John Quincy Adams had a stroke of genius, and John Quincy Adams simply advised James Monroe to go ahead and announce the Monroe Doctrine that would say all European powers should stay out of Western Hemispheric affairs other than the ones that currently had colonies there, but they could not add any more geographic space to their nation state in the Western Hemisphere. And John Quincy Adams told President Monroe, we're just going to announce it unilaterally, and the British will go ahead and enforce it. And in fact, that's what happened. The British were furious with us, but it was in their national interest to enforce that policy. But we certainly took and continue to take credit for it. The third role for the United States in international relations is called a Blue Oceans approach to foreign policy. The Blue Oceans approach really came from Walter Lippmann. We've talked about Walter Lippmann before, one of the greatest political theorists of the 20th century. We find that Walter Lippmann simply believed that the United States, or any country that adopts a Blue Oceans approach to foreign policy, simply we should identify pockets in the world that have very critical resources or highly trained populations that we would like to be allied with us, and we would not want to see fall under the sway of an international adversary. And so where do we find those pockets? Well, one, of course, would be Western Europe. Western Europe has, at the end of the 20th century, you find that Western Europe was the greatest concentration of educated and trained and skilled individuals in the world. And we did not want Western Europe falling under the sway of the Soviet Union. Of course, that's why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded, NATO. And we adopted, under George Kennan's advice, a former Secretary of State, in his famous Mr. X article, the policy of containment, that if we just kept the Soviet Union within the boundaries of that it occupied at that point in time, that eventually it would collapse. And it did. Of course, it is being resurrected now by Mr. Putin, and the emergence of China on the world stage at the present time is a whole nother subject, isn't it? But the Blue Oceans Doctrine says that the United States should pick such pockets of important resources and people such as Western Europe, Japan, South Africa, Israel, those kind of pockets, and we should defend them, Taiwan, and we should defend them to the hilt, and they should be our best allies. So that is another approach that one can take to international politics. The fourth and final approach that the United States could adopt in looking at world politics would be a Wilsonian approach. Woodrow Wilson would say that we should address aggression wherever it occurs in the world, and we should stop it. So this would definitely cast us in the role of world policemen. So those are the four possible roles for the United States in the world. You have to choose one, whether it's isolationism, the Monroe Doctrine, the Blue Oceans Doctrine, or the Wilsonian approach. Well, let's look at historical influences on U.S. foreign policy. We find that the approach that the United States has taken in foreign policy is really the result of values that we've held and experiences that we've had, which were developed in isolation from Europe during the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century. We find that Americans have traditionally and perennially confused the products of geography and international politics. The fact that throughout the 19th century, we were given a period of peace under Pax Britannia. We were protected by the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and we were protected by the Royal Navy having sheer dominance of the oceans. So while the British essentially paid for our defense throughout the 19th century, we could focus entirely on internal development, and we did. The tide turned, didn't it, at the end of the 20th century after the Second World War. We pick up the great burden and the great cost of defense for the Western Europeans, and they are allowed to focus on internal developments. But we have traditionally confused the products of geography that were protected by two vast oceans and international politics. For example, we were protected by the British Empire throughout the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and we confused them with the results of democracy. We viewed continental wars in Europe over the ages, but yet we saw peace in the United States. So we began to believe that undemocratic states were warlike and immoral. We began to believe that undemocratic states are warlike and immoral, and we believed that democratic states were peaceful and moral. You find compounding this, or in addition to this, you have America's vast natural resources throughout the 19th century, the 20th century. We have vast natural resources, and we had a fairly small population. So these are the ingredients for national prosperity, or at least positive expectations for the future for everyone. This sort of situation prevented in the United States, prevented dissatisfied groups from developing a revolutionary ideology in the United States. So America became a one-class society, a one-class society that shared many values and extolled capitalism and democracy to the world. In the world, we essentially adopted a position of moral superiority. We didn't understand the function of power in foreign affairs, but we do develop a posture of moral superiority. Americans develop this strong distaste for power politics, and therefore we begin to believe that there is a clear distinction between war and peace in our approach to foreign policy. We never accepted Clausewitz's definition of war as being the continuation of politics by other means. War is nothing more than the continuation of politics by other means. We always considered war to be a abnormal state of affairs. We did not ever consider war to be a normal state of affairs, but yet, as Durant As Durant tells you in his History of Civilization, we find that throughout the history of mankind, there are only a handful of years. I think when he has his summary volume to his History of Civilization, the 11-volume series, he has a little summary volume that tells us what the lessons of history are. And in there, I believe he tells us that of all the recorded years of history, we've only had something like 13 years in which there was no war anywhere on the globe between or among men. Well, we considered war an abnormal state of affairs rather than a normal state of affairs. So we separated in the United States, we divided force from diplomacy. America has been, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we have been extraordinarily reluctant to participate in foreign affairs, as a matter of fact. When America had to engage in the immoral exercise of war, it felt compelled, if we were going to be involved with an immoral endeavor, such as the exercise of war, then we have to justify the use of force. And we have to justify the use of force in terms of universal moral principles, such as in the First World War, making the world safe for democracy, the war to end all wars. And since America was and is a moral entity, it cannot compromise with the enemy. The enemy has to be immoral. We are a moral force. They are immoral. War is used to abolish power politics and to destroy your enemy, who will always be the embodiment of evil. American wars, therefore, have become ideological crusades. So American wars are and have been ideological crusades. America, throughout its history, has been inwardly oriented, and it can only become involved in world affairs if we have total mobilization efforts. And these total mobilization efforts become ideological crusades, such as the First World War and the Second World War after it. And that continues through Korea and Vietnam as well. Alexis de Tocqueville gives us some very interesting thoughts about foreign affairs and democracies. And again, this is a work, Democracy in America, published in 1835, but he couldn't be more on target even today. He tells us that democracies lack the qualities that are necessary to succeed in foreign affairs. What do democracies lack that is necessary to succeed in foreign affairs? One is the element of secrecy. Very hard for democracies to maintain secrecy. Another element is flexibility. It's hard for democracies to be flexible when you are the moral entity and your adversary is the embodiment of evil, and you wish to destroy them. Democracies also are hard-pressed to have the ability to continue to persevere in very adverse situations. This was certainly seen during the history of the Vietnam War, the ability to persevere in adverse situations. And fourth and finally, democracies lack dispatch, the ability to act speedily. So Alexis de Tocqueville gives us much to think about and reflect upon in those 4 points and the things that democracies need to consider as they conduct themselves in foreign affairs. Well, what are the constitutional responsibilities of foreign affairs? Edward Corwin from Princeton University coined a phrase which stays with us to the day and couldn't be better in defining or describing how foreign policy is to be conducted in the United States. He calls it the invitation to struggle. The foreign policy is an invitation to struggle between the president and the Congress. And part of the reason why it's an invitation to struggle is the fact that the Constitution isn't fully fleshed out in terms of who is supposed to do what all the time, or maybe it is simply just a bit ambiguous. Well, what are Congress's formal powers in foreign affairs? Congress's formal powers in foreign affairs is the Senate is the entity that has to ratify treaties with foreign countries. The Senate has to confirm presidential appointments. The Congress has power over appropriations. And Congress, fourthly and finally, has the power to declare war. So these are the formal powers of Congress in foreign affairs. The Senate's power to ratify treaties, the Senate's power over appointments, the Congress's power over appropriations, and the Congress's power to declare war. What are the informal powers of Congress? The informal powers of Congress would include the fact that Congress is the shaper of public opinion. Congress has the ability to conduct investigations, so congressional investigations. Congress has the ability to issue resolutions. Congress has the ability to have hearings, and congressmen have the ability to travel abroad to see on site what's going on in a certain area of the world. So the informal powers of Congress are that they are a shaper of public opinion, that they can conduct investigations, that they can pass resolutions, that they can conduct hearings, and that they have the power to travel abroad and bring the focus of the press with them. Now let's turn to the president. This is an invitation to struggle. That's what foreign policy is in America. What are the president's formal powers in foreign policy? Well, first and foremost, the president is the commander-in-chief. The president has the ability to send American military forces anywhere in the world that he wishes to do. Secondly, the president's second formal power is the right to make treaties with foreign countries with the 2/3 concurrence of the Senate. Thirdly, something that really comes into focus only after the Second World War, when we have such a great proliferation of nation states following the Second World War and the abolition of the European empires, we have the right to make executive agreements. Executive agreements are formal understandings, legal understandings with other states. They don't have the power of a treaty. They fall somewhat short in that area. A treaty supersedes them, but an executive agreement is an understanding between the president in our country and another country that he has to initial. Fourth and finally, the president has the power of recognition. It is the president and the president alone who decides which countries we have diplomatic relations with. If the president invites a diplomatic envoy from another country to the White House and to be received, that acknowledges then that we have established diplomatic relations with that country. Unless such an invitation is issued, we do not have diplomatic relations with the country without that invitation from the president. What are the president's informal powers in the area of foreign policy? Well, the president has the right to control information from the national security establishment, from the Department of State, for example. The president has the power of opinion. It's very easy for the president to focus the press on himself, and has the ability to try to drive public opinion one way or the other. Thirdly, the president's informal powers in foreign policy is the ability to commit the nation. I've never found a better example of this than what Theodore Roosevelt did on becoming president. As you know, under President McKinley, the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt at that point is his first Assistant Secretary of the Navy before he goes off and helps to organize the Rough Riders for the Spanish-American War. But we find that McKinley builds a world-class fleet to rival the Royal Navy called the Great White Fleet. And when Teddy Roosevelt succeeds McKinley, and after McKinley's assassination, the very beginning of his first term, We find that Teddy Roosevelt wants to show off the fleet to the world, wants the world to be put on notice that America is not to be trifled with. And he wanted an around-the-world journey for the Great White Fleet. And the Congress said no, they wouldn't give him the money for that. But Teddy had enough money, the president had enough money in the pipeline for the Navy Department that he had the funds, sufficient funds to send the fleet to the Philippines, which is exactly what he did. And he told his colleagues, if the Congress wants the fleet back, they'll have to appropriate the rest of the money. And in fact, they wanted the fleet back. They appropriated the money, and the fleet completed the circling of the globe. Fourthly, the president is also able to serve as a leader of the legislature. Another informal power of the president in foreign policy is the president as a legislative leader. Perhaps no one was better at this than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson tightly and strictly controlled the Democratic Republican members of the Congress and was able to have Congress do his bidding. The president is legislative leader. Fifthly and finally, the informal powers of the president are rounded out in that broad area of war powers that the president has at his fingertips that come from his position as commander-in-chief. Let's take a step back for a minute and let's look at the major periods of American foreign policy. There are three major periods in American foreign policy that we need to be aware of. The first period was from 1776, when we announced our independence, all the way to 1815. We find that at the conclusion of the War of 1812. The second period is from 1815 to 1917, our entry into the First World War. And the third period is from 1917, when we enter the First World War, to the present day. Let's take a look at the first period, 1776 to 1815. This period for the United States was a period of a constant struggle for survival. We begin to develop a national sense of mission, and we do this with our commitment to the rule of law and commitment to individual liberty. So our commitment to the rule of law and our commitment to individual liberty begins to help us develop this national sense of mission. We also find that during this period of time, Jefferson had to deal with the Barbary Pirates. Here's one of the first examples of America having to deal with terrorism. He had always believed that the president could only use the armed forces on his own initiative for defensive purposes. So when he wanted to utilize the Navy and launch them against the Barbary Pirates, he went to Congress. He went to Congress for a acknowledgement and approval before we destroyed the Barbary Pirates. The second period was from 1815 to 1917, and this period is generally characterized by a continuing presidential deferral to Congress. In this instance, in this period of time, we find that Congress establishes hegemony over the president, with a few exceptions. The first exception would have been the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is announced by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams on behalf of President Monroe. It brings together a convergence of the interests of the British Empire and the United States, a convergence that continues for the next century, for the next 100 years. In 1846, President Polk, he ordered U.S. forces into disputed territory with Mexico, and he did it on his own. He did not obtain congressional approval first. This serves as a prelude, if you will, to the Mexican War. In 1854, President Franklin Pierce, sends Commodore Perry to Japan to open Japan for international trade. and we all remember the results of that historic trip and expedition. I find that the fourth exception to the rule of congressional hegemony in international affairs was seen with President Lincoln. President Lincoln assumed vast powers in the Civil War. Essentially, he declares martial law, and he suspends the right of habeas corpus during this period of time. But most importantly for international affairs, he bought Alaska. He bought Alaska from Russia, just as Jefferson had gone ahead and bought the Louisiana Purchase from France and doubled the size of the country at the time. We find that this tradition continues with President McKinley, as we talked about before. President McKinley, of course, is the conductor, if you will. He oversees the Spanish-American War. And in the Spanish-American War, what happens? We acquire Puerto Rico, we acquire the Philippines, we acquire Cuba, and other islands in the Caribbean. In addition to that, he sent 5,000 troops to China, and he sent the 5,000 troops to China to help quell the Boxer Rebellion. He didn't get congressional assent for that journey. Next is President Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt. He, on many occasions, sent American troops into the Caribbean, and he built the Panama Canal without looking to Congress for their assent. Well, this takes us to the third period, from 1917 to the present. Here we find that Congress asserts itself against the president in right after 1917. As soon as the First World War ends, we find that the Congress did not go along with President Woodrow Wilson, and they rejected the League of Nations treaty that had been negotiated by President Wilson at Versailles following the First World War. We find that in the aftermath of the Second World War, the character of international relations, of international history, changes dramatically. What happens so that the world in the aftermath of the Second World War is so greatly altered? Number one, you have the destruction of Pax Britannica. The British Empire no longer has an empire in which the sun never sets. We find that the British grant independence to most of its former possessions. They now form a loose confederation, if you will, that's called the British Commonwealth of Nations, but is a fairly weak instrument at this point. But you have the destruction of Pax Britannica. You have a crack-up of the Euro-center world. The world is no longer centered just on Europe. Now you have to be looking at the United States. You have to be looking at China and Japan. Thirdly, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and unfortunately we see it on the march again with the current events in China, this march and this trend towards totalitarianism. Most of us had hoped that we left totalitarianism behind with the destruction of the Soviet Union and the faltering of former People's Republic of China. Well, China, the Communist Party of China, has come back with a renewed vigor, and totalitarianism is essentially, you can argue that it has reasserted itself in China at the present, or if it hasn't, it will in a very short period of time. And another big change, of course, in the world after the Second World War is American involvement. That America now has no choice but to pick up the role that the British had prior to the Second World War. We have to try to ensure order in the world in many instances when the British Empire did so before. We find that another great development in the world in the in this third era is the development of the United Nations. The development of the United Nations, which of course is based in New York. Fourthly, we have the advancement and the implementation of the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was announced by President Truman in a speech to Congress in March of 1947. It started out with a $400 million guarantee, a guarantee for economic aid and for military supplies, initially to Greece and to Turkey, and then would extend elsewhere in a few years. But what he had hoped to do with this, as well as the Marshall Plan, was to strengthen these areas, bolster these areas, so they wouldn't fall or succumb to the siren song of Marxism-Leninism. So we find that the Truman administration accepts a policy of containment. Again, containment is an international policy that was advised by George Kennan, the former Secretary of State, in his famous article in Foreign Affairs. That was signed Mr. X, but eventually we discover it's George Kennan who'd written it. The Truman Doctrine marks the beginning of the containment. But containment again continues in the Korean War as the next development in this third period. And of course the Korean War has to be ended by President Eisenhower after he is elected in 1952. And then again, we find the beginnings of another war. And of course that is in Vietnam. And then we elect President Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, to get us out of that war. And he does end that war, but unfortunately the cloud of Watergate and the uncertainties of Watergate and his resignation lead to the reignition of that war and the fall of South Vietnam. But the last thing, the last elements that you'll see in this third period were the collapse of the Soviet Union. Finally, the Iron Curtain comes down as a result of the efforts of the Reagan administration and the George Bush Sr. administration. And lastly, something that we continue to struggle with to this day, the globalization of the world economy. So those are the events that occur in this last period of foreign policy for America that bear mentioning. I would be delighted to answer any questions that you have on foreign policy or the role of Congress and the role of the President in the conduct thereof. Shoot me an email, give me a call, and I would be happy to talk to you about it. Okay, we're going to go on yet and look at Congress and budgeting, a very shortened version of this particular subject, but you have I want you to focus more on your textbook for that particular chapter. I'll be back with that in a few minutes.
Done.
Okay, that's